Relations. Good evening. My name is Sean Perry Giles, and I'm the director of the Rosenkerr Center for Political Communication and Civic Leadership. We're pleased tonight to welcome Lauren Vance back to campus. Lauren is an alum of the Department of Communication here at the University of Maryland. We are always pleased when the opportunity arises to spotlight the great work that our alums are doing, so we're thrilled that Lauren agreed to come back. Thank you so much for doing so. Lauren has forged a very impressive career in a short amount of time. She, like many of you, completed COMM 386, I believe, the communication internship program, a little over 15 years ago when she went to work for CBS News in Washington, D.C. And from there, she forged her career by working eventually in 60 Minutes and other news organizations where she became a producer and a director. Now she works as a freelance producer and director of news stories, and she works on documentary films. She's particularly drawn to stories, as you see tonight, where she addresses social justice issues. Her stories take her to rural homes as well as inner city homes where she meets with a diversity of people. She's the recipient of an EMMY Award for a story on a young amputee from Ghana who biked his way to the White House on behalf of disabled children who lived in orphanages. Her goal is to present stories that are typically unexplored. She's currently working on a film about America's mass shootings. She's working with youth from Parkland, Florida, and Chicago, Illinois, as they grapple with the deaths of their peers. Tonight, Lauren's going to talk about her experiences as a news producer and a filmmaker and how her degree in communication helped her forge her career. She plans to allow plenty of time for questions and answers, and so we hope that you'll be formulating your questions as you listen, and make sure that you stay for the entire evening. Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us tonight. Please help me in welcoming Lauren back to campus.
Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. All right. Thank you, Dr. Perry Giles and Julie Gowan, who just walked in. She, hi, Julie. Julie is the internship coordinator, actually, and connected us, hence the reason why I'm here this evening. So thank you. First, it feels really good to be back, and it feels really good. I was here earlier this week, and I went over to the radio station. I believe Yenny is here. And hi, Yenny. And I had an opportunity to speak with them, and I guess I was blown away by their enthusiasm as a comm major, and it reminded me of the reasons why I initially got into production. So it was a good way to set off the week. So you guys are gonna have to bear with me because I am gonna also have to work the screens as well. So I think that we are full screen. There we go. Like I said, you're gonna have to bear with me some here. And all right, so I'd like to start this evening and just talk about first, I've always looked at films as an art form. For me, it's key to our understanding of each other. I look at it as a way for us to watch each other, to watch our human behavior, to watch us intersect through deep emotion, laughter, humor, through emotion like tears, emotions that we wouldn't explore, emotions where we find ourselves just a challenge to explore. Sorry, I'm kind of, I thought we were supposed to roll through this. Sorry guys, just some technical issues. Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna keep going and we'll figure it out. So anyway, for me, films are symbols of our reaction and our response to our environment, and they always have been. They're a reaction to the environment around us. For me, it's always been the greatest sort of science experiment to be able to tell a story in response to an event that happens or a tragedy in someone's life and see how the human reaction takes place. I have been very fortunate to be in the living rooms and homes of people across America, like Sean Perry Giles said, in rural communities, in inner cities, sort of learning this intersection of life. And I don't think I ever looked at it as this great social experiment, but it's just something for me that films have always become. And I think what I would like to do to start off is just share with you, it's a quick sample of my work. It's pretty rough. A young woman named Jordan, she's a production assistant. She put it together probably 48 hours for me. And yeah, I think I'd like to start there. And we're not seeing the video. Sorry, we're not seeing the video, guys. Is anyone in IT? We're not seeing the video. That's supposed to scroll through. Yep. You know, I can play it manually. I got it. I'll just do it manually. Okay. So let's try to get back on track. Okay. So like I was saying, this is just a short compilation of about 10 to 12 years of my work. It's just little bits and pieces, kind of rough together, so please don't look at it in terms of story. All right, here we go.
Just what kind of a scene is this?
I think failure, consumes those of us who permit ourselves to become depressed at what we consider to be the lack of success. It's a condition that permeates one's mind, that cripples one, prevents one from being successful.
And I don't know why it is that people want to deride anybody who's different. But it's certainly a part of human nature.
Failure is a word that very seldom, if ever, used, and would prefer for those who are engaging in dialogue with me.
Well, in touch with the Challenged Athletes Foundation, and his journey began, documented in newspapers and on the radio. He was becoming an international hero, honored in Ghana.
Okay, let's remove my prostate so that.
Where did everybody else go? The children go, we want to be there, we want to be with our kids. And he said nobody else was taken to a hospital. And then we said, somebody, a very angry parent said, so what are you telling us? They're all dead? And he said yes. And that's how we found out.
It's not really about the inanimate object, the machinery that is put together. That is not what's inherently evil. It's the person that's pulling the triggers. I can stop what I am doing, and I would go join my fellow brothers and sisters on the line and defend from whatever tyranny or whatever corruption may come through our shores.
So I think it becomes a mindset. Once it becomes a mindset, then it's very difficult to rise above that lowest level of performance. So yeah, so failure is a word I just detest.
I was 6 when Trayvon Martin was shot because of the color of his skin. I was 6 years old in 2012 when 20 kindergartners and 6 staff members were brutally murdered here at San Diego Elementary. I'm now 11 years old. 7 months ago, 17 students were killed at Marjorie Douglas High School. Last week, 7 were shot and 1 man was killed in East Garfield Park in Chicago. My name is Amy Wadler, and I'm here today because we will win.
In our 4-year-long struggle to get Neil Armstrong's suit back on display, I did do a memories of my parents letting me stay out late to see the Apollo 11 moon landing and the first step. So it was a pretty remarkable thing, but it was in my memory, my experience. So, and everything, you know, they're all different works that tell a story. It begins to tell a whole other story beyond the Apollo moon landing. It's an engineering story for me.
I haven't been as challenged since I was a young actor.
What did she say? There you go. We were born out here. Me, my 3 other brothers were born out here.
How much did Vermont people gathering? You went and bought a bus? No, lots came if you want it. We still have lots building if you want it. And, you know, Sequoia helped build on it. That was awesome.
Where's Sequoia?
Sequoia's has a baby. I'm a grandma this year. He's awesome.
Is it difficult that both Hazel and Susie passed away? You had to watch both of them?
I don't know that.
Okay. Is it hard? Was it hard to watch Hazel, your wife?
Yeah.
Is it?
Susie's still alive.
Susie's not alive anymore.
That's number one.
Oh.
That's Susie. I haven't been a picture of Susie. That's Susie. Here's my daughter, the other one I was talking about. Oh, yeah. Got nobody out there arguing. They're both good arguers. Now we win.
Okay.
I learn a new language every day here. Yeah, I do. Do you know where California is?
Yeah, America.
Yes. Where are you from?
I'm from Korea.
Okay.
Shout
Where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? Wow.
My name is Sultan Yasin Salim Muhammad Shahab Abori.
Where did you learn English?
Me? I learned from COMM, American International School. But I studied from movie channel.
What American movies have you watched? Or do you know any American actors?
I saw Avengers, Hulk, Iron Man, Dead of Fight, Fast and Furious 7. Yeah.
What is a mosque to you guys?
It's a place of Allah where Allah like most is in the masjid. So most of the Muslims will go there and pray. And some who don't want to pray, they'll play outside. So I just pray inside.
This is theater, is that not? Theater, is that not?
Yes!
Hey, you have to
sit
go
down here. Come here, come here.
The dirt, everybody was happy. There was no problem. So we just go, some people change and they are not the same. People change.
Tell them to stay.
Shit.
Hold up! Hold up! Hold up!
idea of what I thought I wanted to do while I was there and what we actually did was completely different, but by letting go of these thoughts and these preconceived notions of what you were going to do and how it was going to work, and just kind of start going with the flow.
There's something very sort of beautiful about the whole process. I'm so far away, until we meet again someday. Goodbye, goodbye, baby.
Not really.
What?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. And this is going to be something navigating this. Okay. So let's see. Oh, Jesus. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just, my whole presentation's in here. I thought I was going to scroll through. So anyway, okay. So, you know, so for a lot of the work that I've done, as you can see through the years, I like exploring and getting close to people. You know, I like exploring people's strengths, their weaknesses, their dreams. For me, I've always been someone who has operated from your heart. And when you start in places like news organizations, there's always a lot of discussion about getting too close to a story. And I have never found a way to sort of completely separate myself. Stories stay with me. You know, I've been able to produce and direct for primetime specials, for news magazines, for documentary films, but there's been many challenges along the way. Since I started, I had people saying, you can't do this, or trying to place me in positions and in roles that for me didn't feel like the right thing. I'll start with, you know, I grew up in Germantown, Maryland, a fairly small town in Montgomery County. For me, I was raised by my mother, who was here this evening, my father, along with my sister and brother. We moved there when I was 10 years old. We were, at the time, the only black family on our street. We had a German Shepherd. I loved our backyard, the short walk that we had to the lake. I remember there was a neighbor who didn't like the fact that we were there. I met him the first week. I remember that there were lots of neighbors that through the years that would become our very close friends. I remember taking summer trips with them to the lake and skiing. For me, I didn't know it at the time, but exactly what living in a place like Germantown would mean to me. But it's today that I realize that's where some of the lingering questions that I think I try to answer in my work for myself and other people started. It started shaping my perception of not feeling different, and others saying that you're different. It started there for me. The path also for me started in my family when I learned about public service and the subtle ways in which one can give themselves to the world. I didn't realize it, again, that it was actually called public service, or the many sacrifices it would take to go on in the way of your heart. I just knew that for me, it was a path that I wanted to continue on. I knew that, and I think I realized at a young age that for me, it was about finding kindness and respect among people. From the age of 10 through 18, I was shown just how deeply the world at times may tell you they don't like you. It was during those years that I started to be bullied, and I didn't really find my place. And at night, sort of in the quiet of my room, I would write stories and poems about places and myself in them, and kind of ended my nights praying that the world was as big as my dad and mom always told me existed. So I found friends eventually, and belonging, and sometimes the bully continued. It just didn't seem so severe. I wanted to venture out, always, beyond my immediate environment. I don't know if it was an escape, but for me, I wanted to see something that was outside of my bubble. It would be many years later that I would learn just how important this would be. I remember at 8 years old, our close family friend, a man named Greg Harvey, who has since passed away, came into our lives, and he struggled with addiction. I remember that he also couldn't read, and I remember all of us helping him so he could read. I remember as a young girl sitting at the table reading to him, and I remember the day that he came in with his GED. I remember at 10 years old, first meeting another close family friend who was also my mom's hairdresser and who went on to become a very successful one for people like Oprah. His name was Walter Stone, or better known as Bubbles. Bubbles was 6'2", and he somewhat bounced when he walked into the room, and you bounced with him. He, was his personality was contagious, and his sashaying and sass was also contagious, especially in a place like Germantown in Gaithersburg, Maryland. After a long-fought battle with HIV, he died in 2008 of AIDS. And what I remember from my time with Bubbles is the day I told him I was being bullied at school, and the next day being called down to the office because Bubbles was in the principal's office demanding to see the girls who were taunting me. We traveled a lot growing up. I traveled early on, summers in Brooklyn. I watched films at night with my dad and my family. I watched my mom, an elementary school teacher, form and mold little kids' brains during the day and then come home to us and bring that same excitement. You're probably asking, why am I telling you all of this? I'm saying this because I never feared people, and I think it started there. And it probably wasn't until much later that how much I realized that it would have an impact on my ability to cross in and out of environments where otherwise people probably wouldn't assume I could enter. I came to the University of Maryland into communications because honestly, I probably needed the structure. It was a new sort of beginning for me to take sort of probably my fragmented high school years, and bring it all to a university where I felt somewhat protected to share my opinion, share my mind. I loved films and photography and the arts, and I love science. That's also why I became a communications major. I didn't know exactly what I wanted, but I know I wanted people to see. I wanted people to see something in other people that maybe they weren't accustomed to seeing. And it started again with that interest. From there on, I worked as an intern at the Office of Communications in the District of Columbia. My dad was interim at the time. I ended up at WUSA, the local CBS affiliate channel during 9/11, and also following the sniper case, where I would go on to be on a team of individuals who interviewed John Malvo's wife. It's there where I had the good fortune of coming into contact with a special projects producer by the name of EMMY Repke, who single-handedly literally took me off the desk and put me in her unit as an intern because I was already starting to pitch stories. I would pitch stories to the reporters. I would go to the news director and bug him with ideas. I knew that I wanted to be out there and not sit, for me, on the desk. And probably she was tired of hearing me ask her so much to get out there. I remember the first knock on the door when I was probably 2 weeks into being an editorial producer, the first knock on the door of into, and I always, you know, I remember this because it's one of those moments that I wouldn't know then what it would mean, but it was the first knock on the door to someone's home to ask them if I could come in and speak to them about their 14-year-old child who was just gunned down. And still today, I keep in touch with that family. It was there at WUSA where I met individuals like a young woman named Cindy Chester, who is actually here today. Cindy, you don't have to stand up, who would tell me the story about her boyfriend that she broke up with, who returned to her home the same night and ended up shooting her in her leg, and today she's an amputee. And it would be her story 10 years ago where she would tell me that she found happiness and peace and today has a young daughter. Cindy to me is one of those remarkable stories of physical strength, but also in the face of pain, what endurance looks like. She came from a military family where all of her brothers came home, including her mother, who was a military nurse, but she was the one to lose a limb. I went to New York, and after many people warning me to stay afoot in Washington, D.C., that I knew my contact base, that I knew the people there, that I had won awards, I went anyway. I thought I knew better, that it wouldn't be so hard. So, after trying to find a steady job, I packed up and I went to New York to ABC, and I received a 6-month freelance contract. So I left my very cushy job in DC, and I was working on the foreign desk overnight from 12 to 9 a.m. And then I would work for the digital unit from like 4 to 7. And I also would become a digital journalist, which in those days, I don't think anyone really knew what that would mean. But basically, it meant that you're going to do absolutely everything. So I felt far away, I think, from what I wanted to set out to do, and that was explore stories more in depth. And so for me, the goal was if I can get a story over 10 minutes, I can actually delve into people's lives. I can get closer. But I did the jobs, and I enjoyed it, and I learned, and I grew, and I broke stories, and I worked on investigations. And while I was doing all that at ABC, I started working on primetime specials. I had to start over as a production assistant, and that would be not the last time that I had to start over completely from the ground up. I loved the idea of being on a production team, and that was my first experience of working with one. Sitting in a room, discussing a story with a team of players who were all there to play their part, who all wanted the end product to come together in a way that we all envisioned, and to learn to have to trust someone to do their part so we could get to that final product. This is where I got the first taste of what was possible and what possibly filmmaking could be. So after some time on these specials, I decided to go back to a permanent job, and that's where I found myself at CBS, at the network, on a team that created CBS This Morning. It was an inaugural team, and I worked with people from 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. And from there, I was able to start focusing on those in-depth stories. I did things like domestic drone investigations. I would go back to sort of where I started at WUSA, and I covered, I went back to some of the stories that I worked on at WUSA about tragedies. And I stutter through it because looking back, I covered my first sort of tragedy or mass shooting with Virginia Tech. And I spent 30 days on campus there working with students and their families and completing specials for WUSA. So then I fast forward to my time in New York, and here I am, and the Aurora theater shootings happen. And I was part of this team that was first on the ground, as they say, and last to leave. And again, confronted with the realities of speaking with students, of speaking with families. And then following that year, we would unfortunately experience many more tragedies. I went from there to tragedies like Sandy Hook, where I would again speak with families about their losing their loved ones. It was there that I met the family of Victoria Soto, who lost her life protecting 11 kids, who President Barack Obama would go on to award her family posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was there that I spent 30 days after meeting them in those waking hours, and again, sort of seeing what that heartbreak looked like. Then came the Boston bombing, when again, I was on this small team that touched down just as the second bomb had erupted, and I would again go on this sort of wild goose chase to find out first the details of what happened, because that was most important for a news organization, but secondly, and probably more important to me, who were the victims, who were impacted. So as we were all, as journalists, touched down in this environment, I met a woman by the name of Erica Brannick, who was a teacher in Baltimore, and she had lost her leg in the bombing, and for whatever reason, she allowed me to tell her story. So it was in the wake of the Boston bombing that I spent many days at Spalding Rehab Center in Boston through her recovery. One thing that's sort of interesting, during the Boston bombings, they couldn't find the bombers, and so a few of us were sent to just keep an eye on things in case something happened. And I was standing right outside the perimeter of where the police manhunt was taking place, and they identified the first terrorist, and he had an IED strapped to his chest. And that was sort of the first time that I experienced that, and sort of the realities of sort of the other side of these domestic terrorist attacks in our country. Because I typically worked with the victims, I didn't get that aspect, and that was sort of my introduction. And then it was also later that night, about 24 hours had passed, when I was speaking with a family, and the police ended up surrounding their home because across the street there was a boat where they believed the second terrorist to be, and he was there hiding and bleeding to death. But for me, what stays with me aren't those moments. It's, people like 8-year-old Martin Richard, who lost his life. It's Erica Brannick and her family. I remember the night I first heard the name Trayvon Martin. I had been working late all week, and a senior producer said, "We need you to stay and work on a story of a young African-American man that was shot. Something just doesn't seem right." So it was then that I believe the incident had occurred a week prior, and a handful of local Florida newspapers picked up the story. And then our Atlanta bureau, Mark Strassman and a producer named Chris St. Peter, were the first ones nationally to call in and tell our network that we needed to do this story. And so I worked on a team that night who had to reconstruct everything that we knew, including how the shooting possibly happened from the initial autopsy reports. And after then, I don't think any of us knew it, but we all know today Trayvon Martin. With a blink of an eye, I've sort of found myself a production industry label, someone who can access environments and people under very trying times. It's a label that sometimes, I try to swim my way out of, and sometimes I find myself not wanting to leave it. Along the way, I had people tell me that they saw me doing something very different, and I can't explain why, you know, I sort of fell into this sort of storytelling, but that's the way it's happened. So from there in CBS, I worked on special projects for 60 Minutes. I worked on projects for 48 Hours. And then because of personal reasons and in my family, I went a different way. And that's how I entered into documentary series storytelling. There was a woman by the name of Leanne Danielson and Ann Rothwell, and they reached out to me and asked if I would ever consider true crime. And I didn't know what true crime was, to be very honest. And they said, it's similar to what you're doing, but different. And I said, well, do we get to tell the stories of people like the stories that I've been telling? And they said yes. And so it's been about 7 years now since I've been working on documentary series and crime docs. And again, going across America into people's homes, talking to them about loss and what has left them the most heartbroken. So that's where I started my documentary work. On my downtime, I started working on small films, my own small films. And from there, I worked on bigger films. One of the projects that I did was a traveling photography project where I was responsible for identifying characters, and again, in sort of these underground environments and gaining access to them in their stories. And I would like to show you a clip from a film that I'm currently working on that we're in the final stages of production. Hang on. And again, this is a reel, and so many times for me, I like to see how characters are working out, and so I'll put together these clip reels. So you won't necessarily see a story arc, but you'll get the gist of the story. And this is about a community called Slab City. It's the largest homeless encampment in the United States, and it is basically individuals that couldn't find a safe space on the outside, so to speak. So they went to Slab City to start over. And so I want to introduce you to a few people.
They tried to build this up and make it this crazy community. And then as time went by, you know, the sea got so salty that no one could use it, and that's kind of what's left. To me, it symbolized a lot. It only takes one person to build a dream, too. So one person will sit there, then there'll be more chairs later, and it'll probably build up and become something. One person can take something down, and one person can build something. My picture show? I think the best part about the picture show would be that you would make this picture show and bring everyone together that was in it, and then they could enjoy it with you. If I ever go on a picture show, probably the first person I want to would be my dad. Because it's been like probably 4 or 5 years since he passed away.
If I was creating my own picture show, I'd have my father in it. You know what I wish? I wish he could see me at the level of being somebody I am now, and not how he saw me when he last saw me. I live here in Slab City. There are people, and they have disparaging words, you know, freeloaders, hippies, bums, whatever they want to call us, you know. And I don't know why it is that people want to deride anybody who's different. But it's certainly a part of human nature.
They look at us like we're a homeless encampment.
Which we are.
Just what kind of a scene is this that God has created here and put me in?
Yeah, anything that's left living around here is very resilient.
I know where you're from. I was a vet for 1 year.
I didn't fit in. I've never fit in my whole life.
Yeah, Bill is, I mean, creates a street and he wants to have this party. You know, he sets the stage for you to find your own range. You know, read a poem, dance a jig. I mean, we've had belly dancers, we had a burlesque show.
Even people that don't get along with each other show range.
I get along.
Get along.
It's like unwritten rule.
Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
And we met at the range. The only place I could find it is at the range.
I think it's a participation show. Come on out and do something. You know, if you're learning your first song and you got it down pretty good, bring it on. We'll put you out there, you know. You have the whole sense of crossing the barrier for when you first get up there.
Okay, I just want to be with Lizzie. Whenever you were with Lizzie, it was a special time. That's how she was with everybody. Being with Lizzie taught me how to live another person.
When she talks about her family and stuff, and her friends back home, and all these people back home, and everyone that loves her and stuff, I don't have any common frame of reference for that whatsoever.
My wife Lizzie, 21 years. When God gets up and calls you to glory, you're never ready for that kind of thing. The whole is much.
I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure we have time for the film that I'm working on now, if it's okay. That's the community in Slab City. And so from working on my own stories and from working on documentary series and getting into sort of the space of tragedy, it was last year that I received a call from an executive producer at TIME who oversees their film and video unit, and he knew that I had worked for many years in this sort of tragedy space, and I knew quite a bit about the mass shootings. And he told me about a project where they wanted to collaborate on a national level and tell the stories of what was happening around the country, and this was on the heels of Parkland. And so, you know, for me, I didn't know if I was ready to get back into that world, but it felt different. It felt like the youth of America were responding in a very different way that I had never experienced. And I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that I wanted to be part of it and tell those stories and help tell those stories in America. So what I started on was a journey with TIME and Blumhouse Productions to follow youth in America through the movement of mass shootings and tragedy. And for me, I brought in some of the families that I knew through the years, families like Victoria Soto's from Sandy Hook, but also for me, I wanted to include the stories from the inner cities that happen every day. And so I identified a young man in Chicago by the name of D'Angelo on the west side of Chicago. And unbeknownst to me at the time, because I could never foresee or predict sort of how he would rise in this movement, but all I knew and from all what I read was he had a student mentoring program where the seniors would mentor the juniors would mentor the sophomores, and the sophomores would mentor the freshmen, and that helped them stay off the streets. So I reached out to D'Angelo. I wanted to follow his story, and I knew that I wanted to get the Sandy Hook family involved because to date in America, those are some of our youngest victims. I was on a team, and we followed different people around America. We started with the walkouts that happened last year, and still today we are following their stories. I spent months back and forth to Chicago. I also took a bus ride from Chicago. We drove for 12 hours so we could be at the March for Our Lives, where I saw D'Angelo take center stage. And so that's the current film that I'm working on now. And yeah, I'm kind of more excited out of everything to show you this clip. And you know, it's funny, this is a good time to mention, one of the things that they never tell you is at every level, you have to find your teams. And I've been really, really lucky to be able to tap into people, collaborators and creators and producers. And Jill Kalin is here this evening. She's an associate producer that I've worked with frequently, who have donated their time to help you with your passion project. Films, I think that will change. So, here we go. And so that is the current film clip, the unofficial trailer that you guys are getting to see, because everything is probably 70% still in process. So, you know, I don't know if by what I'm sharing with you tonight is resonating or not. I think that what you to take away is to work on your point of view, especially in filmmaking. There's a luxury that you have that doesn't exist, that I learned for me personally when I was working on news stories. And I loved the direct impact that news stories had. But for me, you know, I always wanted to also be more creative when it came to visually telling the story. I wanted to actually share some of what I thought about the matter. I wanted to go deeper, and I felt like for me, filmmaking, excuse me, was the platform to do that. So for me, I believe what you see, you know, through my eyes is a pathway to my heart. Or sometimes, you know, I go back and forth, and I think my heart is a support of that which is revealed through my eyes. And it's through that, you know, I'm able to communicate and collaborate with others whom I believe have the visual capacity to see. And for you, convey what I felt in that moment while sitting across from someone, while taking my camera and sitting down with them to have a conversation while I listened to their story. So, you know, there's a lot of times when people, especially in production, they want to put you in this sort of very easy box, and you have to find something inside yourself and at somewhere in your center where you can tell yourself during those moments that you're going to try again. I had to start over, like I said, that one time in ABC when I had 3 jobs and I had to do it again. And when it came to filmmaking, I definitely had to start all over. So I say, try again. Just keep trying. And sometimes it doesn't work out. You may have to readjust, but try again. When you hear the no's, and you'll hear many of them. I've always heard more no's than I have the yeses when it comes to getting something greenlit or even finding the rest of my funding. But I think that's when I have to try the hardest. I like using the phrase, and I use it a lot, the Carnival of Dreams. And that for me started a long time ago. I think I have always really enjoyed Charlie Chaplin films and Federico Fellini's 8½, who they utilize sort of this dream, I call it dreamscapes, where it almost feels like if you put everyone's pain, loss, and comedy and tragedy in one bubble, it almost feels like you're floating. And so for me, when I'm on production teams and we sort of descend into someone's environment and they know we're coming, but they never know that I'm gonna have to sit down with them and say, hi, I'm Lauren. Let's discuss that which made you the most heartbroken. What did silence feel like in the aftermath of loss? And will you spend more time with me so I can see how you're making it today? And then share that with all of you, my audience. I've been very lucky to do that, and I hope to do it for a very long time. And there you go. Any questions? Any questions? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Here. Or I think your voice will raise, or will it? Here.
Yeah,
I think the recording's
okay, sure. So thank you for your talk. That was amazing, and I'm just so impressed by your work. It's really beautiful and really touching. I had goosebumps, and I was tearing up at times.
Thank you. It's such a compliment. It means a lot.
You're welcome. So I was just wondering, you mentioned that for yourself it's sort of impossible to like put up that barrier. So how do you do this work without just getting, you know, so overwhelmed at the state of humanity?
Sure. Do we have 2 mics? I thought we did. Well, you know, I to be honest, I used to really struggle with it, and I just became better through the years of acknowledging that you have other things in your life, number one. But I think for me, I embrace it. So by embracing it, you know, you get off the road after spending a year, almost 148 days. That was like the average amount of days on the road when I was working for the network that I would spend doing those tragedies. You embrace it. You give yourself time. You know, you grieve. Someone who says that the stories don't stay with you, that the people you don't think about, they're not being upfront. You know, when Sandy Hook happened, there was an officer who ran out of the school. That stays with you. You know, there were officers bringing body bags out of the school. When when they discovered the young women during the Cleveland kidnappings in that basement who had been captured there for 10 years, and I did that story, you know, and you're seeing a whole community erupt with tears, that stays with you. So you go home, you let it stay with you, you sit with it, but then you get back to your life and you acknowledge and you embrace your life and the people in it. And I've always been very fortunate that I have loved ones and friends, many of whom are here today. And I love animals, like my dog, who's a Great Dane. So honestly, spending time with the things I love, but the moment you try to force it away, I think that's when it builds up. Is that, yeah? Okay, I can grab this. Yeah, if you want to. Any other questions or? Check.
Hi, my name is Zori. Thank you so much for coming and talking
Thank
today.
you. What was your first name?
Zori.
Hi, Zori.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's so important. It's kind of what I'm most interested in as well. So, how did you find that tragedy, looking to tragedies was I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Take your time.
Yeah, sorry. How did you wanted to get into that specifically? Because I know working within the news networks, there's different pockets of things you can do. I know you said that resonates most with you, but how did you get there? I guess is what I'm trying to.
To be honest, and I know this is a one of those probably answers that people hate, but you sometimes, I think a lot in life you fall into it. I was very fortunate because I grew up in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region. So I started at a higher market than most, which is key. If you can do that, I highly suggest it. Not only that, we all know how unique living in DC can be. You have rural communities, you have the inner city. And so I told that story about knocking on my first door, that was in Southeast Washington. And I didn't know what I was doing then. So tragedy was a part of sort of where I started. And I think because I had sort of the ability to want to learn how to tell stories first. So it wasn't so much what it was going to be. I wanted to learn what it took to tell a good story. I wanted to know all those emotions and the heart stuff that I talk about. Well, how can I actually create something that people will understand, but at the same time, still doing it from my heart. And so I understood things like language and scripts in interviews and how language is, to me, one of these great art forms where you're interviewing a people, you're going back, you're listening to your video, you're taking that language, and then you're putting it into a piece, and then everyone else has to listen to it and understand it. So it was that for me first, I would say, and then the tragedy sort of world happened. I also think when Virginia Tech happened, there was a part of me that, for whatever reason, I just wasn't fearful of speaking with these students who had just experienced, probably one of the worst things in their lives, next to losing losing a family member. So that was it. A lot of the things in life that I took with me from, I think, when I was growing up, the experience with Bubbles, who died of AIDS, knowing Greg Harvey. I didn't realize what those moments meant, but what it taught me was I didn't have fear for people, and I knew that I didn't want people, us, to fear each other. And so for me, the tragedy just represented the pain and the loss by which I think we all connect. And I started seeing that. So I think I did raise my hand more because that's what was attractive to me, our response to that pain and how it connects us, and then coming out of it, sort of the love and kindness. So it was all these things, not so much the actual event. And I'm talking about this a lot because I think you've raised a really good question, because I think right now you have this race when you're coming out of school to check your war card, so to speak, right? You got to get overseas. You want to check your tragedy card. I got to cover a mass shooting in order to get credibility. And I would say get really good at just telling stories every day. And then those things will come. If you're able to go into those environments and tell the best story, then it all starts to come together. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Emma.
Hi,
I
Emma.
know you talked a little bit about being the only black family on the street in Germantown, and being a black woman. How did you find your experience in this industry? and everything like that?
Sure. It's a great question. That's a long question. Where do you begin? How I think of myself and my ability to sort of address perspective in life, I know it comes from so many strong, creative Black women before me who didn't have this sort of luxury to get up and talk about story the way that I'm able to, from this very sort of collaborative approach. And so I think first off, in the back of my mind, I'm always mindful of that, of just, that the saying, the shoulders that I'm standing on. At the same time, I have always been open to other people's experience. And that's sort of, where the experience of perhaps, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but living on a street, being the only Black family, honestly, I didn't notice it until somebody told me it, in terms of like, you are the only one. Yes, we're Black. Yes, we have cultural experiences that we have and do, but so do you. So I would say that experience sort of shaped me in that way to have a strong foundation to know who I am. At the same time, I wanted to stay open to people's stories. Through the years, I've had, I've been on many teams when I am the only one that still exists today. 95% of the time, sometimes the only female, most of the time the only female, but 90% of the time I'm the only Black person, let alone Black woman. And I know we're making some progress, but I also know there have been projects that I've worked on where I was the only full-time Black female working on the project. And I think at times it's isolating, but at the same time, for me, I know that I have stories that I want to convey to sort of enrich our own understanding of each other. And so, I call it, I was saying the other day, it's like, this like invisible stage that I've always thought that I start on. And then in turn, I can hopefully create it for other people. And whether it's race or religion or people of a higher background, socioeconomic background, or a lower socioeconomic background, I want there to be some intersection. So for me, I've always kept that in mind. And I always, try to hire a diverse, sort of rounded out body of people, and that's something that's just always come very naturally. And I hope that everyone else kind of gets on board and continues that. So, yeah. Any
other questions? What would you say, what would be your best advice for people trying to actually get into these fields? I mean, they're pretty tough fields to get into. So what do you think are the best ways to do that? And then kind of a two-parter, but the subjects you deal with are pretty sensitive. How do you handle talking to people where it's that sensitive, or is there an approach to it, or some sort of method, or anything like that?
And what's your first name?
Cameron.
Okay, Cameron. Cameron also worked with some of the teams that I've worked with before. It's nice to see you guys here. So your first question in terms of like breaking through, so to speak. If the one thing you're not learning in communications to speak to people, you should, take some classes before you leave and make sure that that's probably one of your most critical aspects of probably learning in terms of going out there will be. And I say that to say, I don't by any means know the art of a cold call, but you will send probably in your lifetime of being in production, I imagine close to 10,000 combine cold calls of emails and phone calls, just asking for an opportunity. And it usually goes like, hi, I'm Lauren. I'm, like at the time when I was just starting out, I'm a student, I have these interests. I saw that you're doing X, Y, and Z. I'd love to just talk to you about it more. And by the way, can I come shadow you maybe? And then from there, you hope you do a really good job and they call you, and 90% of the time they won't. And then 10% of the time they do, and you have to do that all over again. And I will tell you today, 15 plus years in it, I still do those same things as an independent producer and director. But you do have to have a certain amount of courage to call people, to talk to people. I've had to borrow gear from companies like Sony, where I've literally, when I was starting over, I sent them an email and I said, I've done X, Y, and Z. I want to make this transition. Everyone's telling me no. I really need just some gear, a lens, a camera. And I was really fortunate. A woman by the name of Cindy Silva reached back out to me and she said, Lauren, we want to help you. And today, I'm in their Sony's female filmmaker group. So I think that you have to take a chance on yourself and keep pushing to speak with the people that you want to work with. Who do you admire? What shows, honestly, don't think the world is that big. And I don't mean that sort of in a pessimistic way. It's that when you start to think of it as a bit smaller, it's much more in your reach. And so calling someone like Kodak and saying, hi, I heard you're building this camera. I want to be the first student at University of Maryland to test it. I want to do a 5-minute video. Well, you've just not only negotiated your way with a major company, but then you're also, you've created your first piece of work. And it's about creating your body of work. So, I would say have courage in yourself and don't think of the world as too big. What was the second question, Cameron?
What's your approach to talking to subjects on really sensitive topics, whether it be lost family members or loved ones or anything like that?
Sure. So I'll share, in October, I spent 6 weeks in a community called Kensington. It's the largest open market drug market in America today. It's a tough place right now. I think they declared it a national emergency just because of the amount of just drugs and needles, and they're actively moving people out of that community. And this is going to be for an A&E show. And without telling too many details, because I don't think I'm allowed to, but there was a character who I was following whose family just they didn't want to be a part of it. They didn't want to be identified. They didn't want their son to be a part of it. And so with situations like those, and you encounter that a lot, you really have to focus on who you are and be yourself. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but if you're not willing to approach a family member who is dealing with a challenge or a tragedy and present yourself exactly how you are, they're gonna smell it. They're not gonna connect with you, and there will be no silent agreement that you both are gonna take this emotional journey together, because that's what you're doing in production, whether you're doing scripted and you're gonna mimic these behaviors, or if you're doing documentaries, you're mimicking these individuals' stories. And so you need them to be their most comfortable self, and that starts with you. And so a lot of people try to find sort of a template, sort of a machine, if you will, where they can go into someone's house and tell them everything they want to hear, instead of operating from just a very genuine place and saying, I've only been doing this for a year, for example, and I was interested in your story because of this. I think you have a greater chance of actually being able to be in their lives and for them to be open to you. And I'm not saying share your personal business in your life. That's not either. I'm just saying come as you are, and also be prepared to know something about their community, about their family, and a willingness to stay open to their story. I think that's the beauty of documentary films, is that you get to be open to their story, or, you know, why are you doing it? So that's what I would say.
Lauren will be happy to answer questions, you know, afterwards for a few minutes. So if you do have remaining questions, but let's join me in thanking Lauren for being with us.
You guys need better light.